This is episode 131 of the Death to Tyrants podcast. Hey guys, let's take a minute to talk about one of our sponsors, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee. I love these guys, not just because they were our very first sponsor, but because, like I've said many times, their coffee is so damn good. If you guys like coffee that tastes the way coffee is actually supposed to taste, with natural flavors that come from the region and the roast of the beans rather than from artificial flavorings like some other brands use, well, then you'll love Lorenzotti Coffee. If you're a real coffee drinker like myself, you don't want these weird flavors in your coffee like key lime pie or blueberry muffin. You want strong, traditional flavors that actually come from the beans themselves, and that's exactly what you get with Lorenzotti Coffee. You can get Lorenzotti's signature Venetian blend. This stuff comes right from Italy, okay? You can do whole beans, medium fine grind, which that one's actually perfect to use in the French press like I prefer. It comes in these really cool, beautifully designed, resealable tins that ship to you hermetically sealed and keep the coffee very, very fresh. Guys, I cannot speak highly enough of Lorenzotti. They're lovers of liberty. They love this show. They support this show. So why not support them by getting yourself some damn good coffee? So go to lorenzotti.coffee. That is LORENZOTTI.coffee. Guess what? We got a promo code, and that, as you know, is DTTP for Death to Tyrants podcast. You'll get 10% off your order at checkout. Again, that's lorenzotti.coffee. Enter code DTTP at checkout. Let's get to the show.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram wrath. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas. Before we jump into this episode, I just want to say really quick, what an amazing time last weekend down in Lake Jackson, Texas for the Ron Paul Symposium put on by, of course, the great Mises Institute. And I highly recommend anytime you're able to attend a Mises function, you got to do it. It's first class all the way. And, especially now in a time like this where people are running around angrily masked up just so they don't, they'll say it's because they don't get or spread COVID or get COVID or whatever. But it's really because it's all theater and they don't want to piss off someone in the store and get yelled at and get in a big fight, be seen on YouTube after that, and the rest. In times like that, it's nice to get away and be around sane, wonderful, like-minded, smart, normal individuals at a function put on by the Mises Institute. And I must say, I met a lot of you guys out at that function. And for those of you that got to come back into the little Death to Tyrants after party, what a fun time that was. Thanks for coming to that. And it was nice hanging out and meeting you guys and just being around normal, smart people. That's it's sad that that's kind of an escape that we have to do these days, but so be it. It was, and it was a great time. So now on to this episode. My guest is Scott Ritter. If you're not familiar with him, well, you will be by the time this is over. He has been around for quite some time. I've been following him for decades. And let's put it this way. You can look up online on YouTube. It's still there. He had multiple back and forths with Joe Biden. Scott Ritter testified before the United States Senate Committee on Armed Services and the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and said that he resigned his position out of frustration that the United Nations Security Council and the U.S., as its most significant supporter, was failing to enforce the post-Gulf War resolutions designed to disarm Iraq. Well, those WMDs that we were supposed to find, that we went to war over? My guest, Scott Ritter, knows all about it because he was a United Nations weapons inspector in Iraq from 1991 to 98. So he knew that maybe there was more to this story than just WMDs. And that's what we're going to get into because we want to talk about if Joe Biden does turn out to be the winner of this whole mess, what would his foreign policy look like? Now, obviously, if you're listening to this show, you probably know well, it's not going to be it's not going to be good. And especially if you're anti-intervention, as most of you, I assume, are, like myself, well, that's not Joe Biden. And it's weird because the last 4 years, Trump has not started a new war. We're going to see where things go. He hasn't really ended these either, like we would like him to. But now I'm wondering if he's going to fast track a few things and try to start pulling troops home ASAP, which would be wonderful. And then it's going to put a really ugly light on Joe Biden when he starts sending the troops right back over. So it should be interesting. But like I said, we're going to get into Joe Biden's idea and philosophy of what his foreign policy is, his intervention-loving foreign policy, unfortunately. And again, this is Scott Ritter. He's been around this stuff for years. He's been writing about it. He's got multiple books out. Let me tell you about him really quick. Scott Ritter is a former United Nations weapons inspector in Iraq from 91 to 98. He later became a critic of the United States foreign policy in the Middle East. Prior to the invasion of Iraq in March 2003, Ritter stated that Iraq possessed no significant weapons of mass destruction capabilities, becoming, according to the New York Times, the loudest and most credible skeptic of the Bush administration's contention that Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction. He knew it was wrong because he was there on the ground and saw exactly what was going on, and it was not what the New York Times and the mass media, the military-industrial complex, or certainly Joe Biden or George Bush were telling you. So please welcome my guest today on the show, Scott Ritter. Scott, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yourself?
I'm doing quite well. I'm very excited to finally get you on here because, for a multitude of reasons, but your story is fascinating, to say the least. Can you tell my listeners your background and what you did throughout the 90s for those who are going, well, why should I listen to this gentleman? You've kind of got an insider's perspective. So talk about your past and what you did.
I was commissioned as an officer in the Marine Corps in 1984, and I was trained as an intelligence officer. And I actually spent a good part of the 1980s preparing for war with the Soviet Union. I was with the Rapid Deployment Force for the Marine Corps component of that, the 7th Marine Amphibious Brigade out of 29 Palms, California. Served on the brigade intelligence staff, and then later on as the intelligence officer for 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, a field artillery unit. And so I was just your basic Marine doing Marine stuff when in December of 1987, I was surprisingly tapped by the Headquarters Marine Corps to join an organization called the On-Site Inspection Agency. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev had signed a treaty in December of 1987 called the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And the purpose of that treaty was to eliminate two categories of nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, short-range missiles and then intermediate-range missiles. So basically missiles, up to between 500, 5,000 kilometers in range. I had no background in missiles, nuclear weapons, or anything of that nature. But in college, I was a Russian history major and took 2 years of Russian language. So, Headquarters Marine Corps believed that my resume was sufficient to the task. I ended up helping install and then later implement what's called a continuous portal monitoring facility outside a Soviet missile production facility in Vodkinsk, about 900 kilometers east of Moscow in the foothills of the Ural Mountains. This was one of the most fascinating jobs one can imagine. Remember, this is the height of the Cold War when the Soviets were our enemies. And the missiles that were coming out, the SS-25 Road Mobile Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, aimed at American cities. We weren't there to limit that production. We were there to make sure that the Soviets didn't use that legitimate production line to produce what was called the SS-20, an intermediate range missile that was banned under the treaty. And so for 2 years, from 1988 to 1990, I did this job. And what's important about this job is not only was it about arms control and getting into the minutiae of what an arms control agreement is, what constitutes a binding commitment under a treaty, it also dealt with on-site inspection, that is, being physically present on the ground inside the territory of the inspected party. This was the first time in modern arms control history that this had been done. And I literally helped write the book on on-site inspections. Why is this important? Well, when I left the job in 1990, I went back to the Marine Corps and I got involved in the war, the Gulf War, just like many others did. I was assigned to General Schwarzkopf's staff, where because of my missile background, or at least my perception of being a missile expert, I became heavily involved in the counter-Scud operation. That is, tracking down Iraq's Soviet-made Scud-B missiles, which had been modified by the Iraqis to have a greater range. They went from 300 kilometers to around 680 kilometers, enabling them to hit targets in Israel and throughout the Gulf Arab states. There was a great fear that if Iraq's missiles hit Israel in a way that resulted in sufficient casualties, that Israel would enter the war and thereby destroy the coalition that then President George H.W. Bush had built to take on Iraq. And this was a frustrating job for a number of reasons. One, we didn't kill any Scuds. Despite all the media hype you might see about it, none were killed. And the Iraqis showed a proclivity to survive. When the entire world was pretty much lined up against them. The war ended, and Iraq was required, as a part of the ceasefire agreement, that is a Security Council Resolution 687, to have their weapons of mass destruction. There's 4 categories: nuclear, chemical, biological, and long-range ballistic missiles. Those modified Scud-Bs I talked about, they were to be destroyed, dismantled, or rendered harmless under UN inspections. Again, on-site inspection. I was requested by a colonel who worked with me in the Soviet Union, who's my boss, to come in and help set up an intelligence unit in the United Nations. This request was made in August of 1991. The reason why, normally when you have an agreement like we did with the Soviet Union, both sides, it's a bilateral agreement. Both sides would submit declarations of what they had, and then inspectors would come in and verify this declaration, and then dispose of the material as mandated by treaty. The Iraqi disarmament obligation was not a bilateral agreement. Iraq was the only party being disarmed, but they were still required to submit a declaration that listed the totality of their holdings. Iraq did so, and the initial inspection teams went in only to find that Iraq had lied and that Iraq was concealing significant aspects of its weapons program. First of all, they failed to declare a nuclear program. They failed to declare a biological program, and they grossly underdeclared their chemical weapons program and their ballistic missiles program. So now we could no longer trust the Iraqi declaration. And so I was brought in as an intelligence professional who had experience not only with Iraq, but also arms control, on-site inspection, to help the United Nations hunt down and get the truth about Iraq's weapons program. I started that job in September of 1991. I did that job for 7.5 years. I ended up resigning in August of 1998 in protest to what I believed was the interference by the United States in the work of the inspectors, preventing us from carrying out our job. This was a difficult job. Again, we go back to the traditional arms control gentleman's agreement where you submit a declaration, teams come in and verify it, and it's done based upon agreed upon procedures. When Iraq started cheating, they lost the right to have agreed upon procedures. The United Nations inspectors were given great latitude to use whatever means necessary to find hidden programs. And this means that we came in hard. We went to sites that were not declared by Iraq. Many of these sites were sensitive. Many of the sites dealt with their intelligence, with their security, with presidential security. And we used means such as U-2 spy airplanes to take high-resolution photographs. We brought in covert SIGINT teams to monitor their communications. And we did a number of other things that are related to intelligence work to try to find the truth. And we were pretty successful at it. By 1995, 1996, we could safely say that we had accounted for around 95% of Iraq's declared and undeclared weapons capabilities. There was 5% that we knew existed, but we couldn't prove had been dismantled, largely because of the combined effects of the war, which blew a lot of things to hell and makes verification difficult, and also the fact that Iraq, when they undertook to hide this material, did not document it very well. And when they sought to destroy this material before it was found, they didn't document that very well. It wasn't that we thought that this material existed. It's that we didn't know how it had been destroyed. And so we were searching for basically evidence of destruction more than evidence of existence. But because it was not firm being destroyed, many people who had a differing opinion on what should be done with Iraq decided that we weren't going to give Iraq credit for this. You see, the United States government, starting in 1991, didn't have a policy of disarming Iraq. They had a policy of removing Saddam Hussein from power. And they were using the inspection process as a vehicle to continue economic sanctions that had been imposed on Iraq in August of 1990, but should have been lifted when Kuwait was liberated. They wanted to continue these sanctions as a means of containing Saddam and undermining Saddam so that he could be removed from power. This was all about regime change. And my inspections and the inspections of others in Iraq were inconvenient to this because, we were okay when we were showing that Iraq was cheating, when Iraq was lying. But when we started to uncover evidence that Iraq might indeed be telling the truth near the end of this process, that everything had in fact been accounted for and destroyed, suddenly that was a message that Washington, D.C. did not want to hear. And that's why they interfered with the inspections, shut down our mission, closed down our intelligence gathering capabilities. And that's why I resigned in September of 1998.
What takeaways do you have from that particular experience, especially towards the end? Do you feel at all like your task force or your group of brothers and sisters and workers was used at any time during this?
Well, we knew we were used from day one. I mean, the fact of the matter is we had a Security Council resolution that gave us, that was our sole basis of authority. And you need to understand this. I started taking into Iraq or participating in inspections in December of 1991. Other inspectors had began going in sometime in late May, early June of 1991. Iraq was not a defeated nation. They lost the war, but Saddam Hussein was still in power. We were inspecting them the same year that we had just fought a war with them. We did not go in with guns. We did not go in armed. We did not go in wearing body armor. We went in dressed in civilian attire with an armband, a blue hat, and a passport that said, "We are inspectors here to do a job." When the Iraqis decided we didn't want to do a job, they would put soldiers in front of us with, fully armed machine guns and weapons. Oftentimes they pointed those weapons at us. Sometimes they shot those weapons over our head or at our feet to stop us from doing things. So it was a very confrontational environment from the beginning. We knew we were in trouble two ways. One, Iraq wasn't allowed to do any of that. If you under the Security Council resolution, which was tied to the ceasefire commitment, if Iraq violated its obligations, then inspectors would be removed and the war would continue. That's not something I'm making up. Those were the rules that were put forward. And that's the only thing that gave us the ability to do the job. Because if you didn't have that threat of war, of this giant hammer hanging over Iraq, they would never have let us gone in there and do what we did. But even then, they confronted us and they obstructed us. And the Security Council, under the guidance of the United States, opted to do nothing. Now, that weakens the hammer, gives the Iraqis more confidence. And every time we came in, and remember, each successive inspection became more and more confrontational. So we have less and less assurances that we're going to be backed up by the Security Council, and yet we're called upon to be more and more aggressive. And when we would talk to the Iraqis, and they were very forthcoming, I would talk to Tariq Aziz, I would talk to Amir Rashid, very senior minister. I would talk to the people that were closest to Saddam and ask them why they were obstructing. And they said, well, why should we cooperate with you? Let's say we do everything you ask us to do. Let's say we let you into every one of these facilities that are sensitive to us, closest to our national security. Why should we let you into presidential security when your government has tasked the CIA to assassinate our leader? You're an American. You're a former intelligence officer. You will see things that we don't want you to see. What guarantees do we have that you're not going to report it back? And next thing we know, our president is targeted using that information. Well, there are no guarantees other than my word as a gentleman that as an inspector, I wouldn't do that. But, they're not going to trust me on that. Moreover, they said, let's say we let you in and you find everything that we believe will prove that we no longer have weapons of mass destruction. Will sanctions be lifted? And the answer is no, because successive U.S. presidential administrations, starting with George W. Bush, going through Bill Clinton, said, even if Iraq fulfills its obligations under Security Council Resolution 687, economic sanctions will not be lifted until which time Saddam Hussein is removed from power. We knew this in 1991. And yet our job wasn't to play politics. Our job wasn't to sit there and say, well, this side's right, this side's wrong. Our job was to be faithful to the mandate under Security Council Resolution 687, which called us to go into Iraq and oversee the verifiable disarmament, dismantling, and removal of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program. That was the only job we had, but we knew from day one we were being used by the United States, and we were to this grand political game between Iraq and the United States.
What was Joe Biden's role in the run-up to the Iraq War, the 2003 version of the Iraq War?
Well, Joe Biden had a seat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And as such, he was very influential in terms of getting the Senate to support the Iraq policies of both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, but especially Bill Clinton. His position as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee put him in that gang of eight. Those eight very senior committee leaders from the Senate and the House who are briefed on the covert operations and the sensitive policy decisions of any government, whether it be a Republican or Democrat. So he knew that the policy of the United States was regime change. He was briefed on not only George H.W. Bush's lethal findings to the CIA to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but also Bill Clinton's lethal findings, authorizing the CIA to use any method up into the death of the leader of Iraq to remove him from power. He knew that weapons inspections were merely an artifice, a mechanism that was useful to the United States so long as they allowed the United States to say Iraq has weapons of mass destruction and economic sanctions must be continued. He knew that was the policy, but he also knew that if sanctions were lifted, if the inspections found that there were no weapons of mass destruction left, the sanctions would never be lifted. He knew this, but he pretended that he didn't know this. He knew that Bill Clinton in 1998 made a decision not to support aggressive inspections against Iraq. Those were my inspections, the inspections I was leading, and to dismantle the intelligence apparatus that I had assembled to find the truth, because he knew we were very close to finding the truth. And the truth would have been that Iraq does not have a weapons of mass destruction capability. That was a message that the United Nations would never be allowed to administer. That's why they prevented me from doing inspections. I was in Iraq in August of 1998, ready to do an inspection, when Madeleine Albright, then the Secretary of State, made a phone call pulling me out of Iraq. I mean, Joe Biden knew about this because he is the Senate, the Democratic minority leader of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In September of 1998, I testified before a joint session of the Armed Forces Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate. It was the first time in history anybody ever did a joint testimony between those two committees. So it was it's a big honor to have been invited to do that. Joe Biden's job was to attack me, to denigrate my message, to reduce my credibility as a witness. He mocked me as Scotty Boy. He said that I was dealing with things above my pay grade, that other people got paid big bucks to make these decisions. That was why they got limousines and I didn't. And he went on and on and on, to no avail, because when the hearing finished, he was widely attacked by Republicans and Democrats alike for the smear he ran on me. So much so he had to publish an apology in the Washington Post. And then he called me into his office for a meeting afterwards. That meeting took place in October. And we met for about 45 minutes. We had a long discussion about Iraq and why he said what he said, et cetera. And afterwards he said, this was very useful. This is an issue that's not going away, and I look forward to talking with you in the future. I took that letter to heart. And in 2000, in the lead up to the presidential election, I was concerned that there was a lot of irresponsible rhetoric. Let's back that up. In December of 1998, Bill Clinton authorized a military strike against Iraq, Operation Desert Fox, that used the intelligence that my team gathered about Saddam Hussein to try and kill Saddam Hussein. The Iraqis were fully aware of what's going on. They're not stupid. They did the cause-effect relationship. The very sites that our cruise missile were hitting were sites that only I knew about, my team, that we inspected. And so they knew that basically inspectors were gathering information that was passed to the United States, who then tried to kill their president. Everything they were afraid of with inspections. So they terminated cooperation with inspections, and no inspections were in Iraq from December 1998 through actually up until November 2002. But in 2000, there were no inspectors, and speculation was running wild about what Iraq could have done in the intervening time. And this was one of the dominating topics of the 2000 election, how the United States should be prepared in the next administration to hold Iraq to account. I was very concerned that this was irresponsible, and I approached Joe Biden, John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, Senator Lugar out of Indiana, and I said, we need to get together and talk about this. They said, put it in writing. So I wrote an article that was published in June of 2000 in Arms Control Today, a very prominent arms control journal, that made the case for Iraq's qualitative disarmament over quantitative, meaning that we can't count for every nut, bolt, and screw. That's quantitative disarmament. We can say hard facts pretty much assures us that Iraq doesn't have a weapon of mass destruction program. And I back this up with hard facts derived from my time as an inspector. Just a short footnote. Later on, in the aftermath of the 2003 war, when the CIA did their final assessment saying there are no W&D in Iraq, their final assessment is exactly what I wrote in 2000, because I was the intelligence guy. I ran the intelligence operation. I knew everything there was to know about Iraq, and I knew that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction. It's that kind of credibility I brought to the table. Chuck Hagel met with me for an hour. And while Joe Biden didn't meet with me, he sent his chief of staff to meet with me. And they both said, Chuck Hagel was the honest one. He said, don't expect any profile and courage moments. Because I was trying to get Hagel and Biden to come together to lead a hearing about, to find the truth about Iraq. Hagel said couldn't do it. He couldn't get ahead of the Republican candidate. Biden's chief of staff said they couldn't do it because Biden wasn't going to get ahead of Al Gore. And the bottom line is both of these guys knew that what they were saying about weapons of mass destruction wasn't true, but they weren't willing to take the political risk to tell that truth to the American people in a highly politicized situation. In 2002, in the summer 2002, we had the same situation. The Bush administration, in the aftermath of September 11th, was beating the drums of war, talking about the need to invade Iraq, using weapons of mass destruction as the trigger for this. And I again approached Joe Biden, Richard Lugar, and others in the Senate to have a hearing about this. At first, they said there wasn't a need for a hearing, but the pressure that was put on them was so much, and I was part of that pressure, that they had to have a hearing. But rather than invite me and anybody who might have a contrarian point of view, but I would say a contrarian point of view based upon firsthand experience as opposed to much of the speculation that they brought in, they lined up witnesses who were known frauds. For instance, Khidr Hamza, who called himself the father of Iraq's nuclear weapon. He was anything but. He was a fraud. Everybody knew it. But they brought him in. He talked about how they were on the verge of making a nuclear bomb. He brought in other people. And the whole purpose of that hearing was to basically pave the way for war by creating Iraq, painting a picture of Iraq as, as a nation that posed a threat born of having weapons of mass destruction. This hearing, gave Biden and others political cover to vote in favor of military intervention, and that gave basically George W. Bush the green light to invade Iraq in March of 2003. And even after the war, when we didn't find any weapons, Joe Biden continued to defend his decision, saying it was the right thing to do. And interestingly, he said, I talked to everybody, and nobody told me that there might not be weapons of mass destruction. Well, I'm sorry, Joe. I called you up repeatedly. You talked to me. You gave me a letter telling me you wanted to talk to me anytime. You refused to talk to me, but you knew the message. You knew what I was saying, and you shut me down. So that's Joe Biden's role. I have no use for him as and I'll say this, this is full disclosure. I have no use for him as a politician. I have no use for him as a person. And I definitely have no use for him as a potential commander-in-chief of the United States because he's a liar. Because he doesn't have the moral courage to stand up and do what's right, because he allowed America to go to war to better his own political ambition. This is a man who is willing to put the lives of thousands of Americans at risk. And indeed, thousands of Americans have died. Tens of thousands have been wounded. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have been killed in a war that didn't need to be fought just because Joe Biden and others decided that pushing for a war and looking tough would look good on his political resume. He's running for president. He ran for president. People voted for him because of that resume. It's a deceitful resume. It's a resume that doesn't tell the whole truth unless you dig deeper and find out that Joe Biden actually knew the truth about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when he made that vote. But he used his position in the Senate to create the impression that Iraq had weapons, even though he knew they didn't.
Yeah, wow, that's powerful. Let me ask you this. Do you think Joe Biden has an actual philosophy when it comes to foreign policy? And if so, what would that be?
Well, it's an interventionist philosophy. But here's the problem. See, I would respect somebody who had a philosophical approach to America's interaction with the rest of the world based upon the premise that we are the shining city on the hill and that we are the defenders of good and that we have a duty and responsibility to intervene if necessary in order to promote the general good of the world. This is in line with what's called the post-world order, liberals, the post-war rules-based liberal world order that emerged after World War II, where the United States would take the lead in working with like-minded nations based upon a accepted rule book that would be quantified as law, international law, regarding international trade, international relations, and promoting the general welfare of democratically aligned nations. I don't necessarily believe in that myth. In fact, I don't believe in that myth. I think it's just that, a myth. But that doesn't mean that other people can't believe in it. And I respect people who have firmly held beliefs. Even if I disagree with those beliefs, I respect their right to have those beliefs and to articulate in defense of those beliefs and act based upon those beliefs. So if Joe Biden actually believed in this and felt that this was the proper role of the United States, then I would say, I don't agree with him, but he's a man of honor who's doing what he believes in. And then I'll be more than happy to engage in a debate with him, but I'm not going to speak ill of the man. The problem is Joe Biden doesn't believe in any of this. Joe Biden believes in Joe Biden. Most politicians in Washington, D.C. don't believe in any of the things they say. They believe in themselves. They believe in using the political system to enrich themselves, to empower themselves, and to position themselves for even greater enrichment and greater empowerment. Joe Biden is somebody who used foreign policy as a vehicle to allow him to pontificate on the Senate floor, allow him to pretend to be an expert in things he had no background in, and to allow him to be perceived as a man of strength by relying on the strength of others. That is, the men and women who serve in the armed forces, the men and women who serve in our diplomatic services, the men and women who serve America abroad. That's our true strength. And he relied on them. He pushed them to intervene in wars we didn't need to be involved in so that he could look strong at their, based upon their sacrifice. Joe Biden doesn't believe in anything he says. Joe Biden is about Joe Biden. Look, if he believed in what he said, he would have joined the military. I'm sorry. I mean, if you're going to be someone who's going to sit there and pound your fist on the table and talk about the absolute need for intervention, then you better at least have put your name on a piece of paper, put your hand in the air, taken an oath, and put on the uniform, and been given the opportunity to give your life for your country before you come back and start talking about policies that will require other Americans to give their life. He didn't do that. He went straight in. He's a man who, sought to enrich himself through various laws that, about corporate policy in America. And he's a man who used his position on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to promote conflict around the world, simply for the purpose of looking strong.
I want to tell you guys about a great sponsor of the Death to Tyrants podcast, and that is our friends over at Zippix Toothpicks. These are flavored toothpicks. They've got several great flavors. Check these out: cinnamon, clove, mocha, and whiskey even. But not only that, each toothpick actually contains nicotine, and I use these toothpicks all of the time. Not only are they a great alternative to that nasty habit you may be trying to stop, and that includes vaping, come on now, but they taste great. They are way more socially acceptable. They are cheaper than any alternative. Hell, I don't even dip or smoke or anything like that, and I still love these Zippix toothpicks. Out of all the alternatives on the market, these are the most cost-effective, and better yet, they are a sponsor of this show. When a small business is out there helping to support one of your favorite Liberty podcasts like this one, let's thank them by returning the support. Since you are a loyal listener to the Death to Tyrants podcast, you will get 10% off of your order by entering promo code DTTP at checkout when you order over at zippixtoothpicks.com. Once again, go to zippixtoothpicks.com. That's ZIPPIX toothpicks.com and type in promo code DTTP for Death to Tyrants podcast at checkout, and you will get 10% off of your order, and you will be supporting Zippix and Death to Tyrants at the same time. So go do it. Let's get back to the show. You've said so many names throughout this conversation that everyone knows. Bush 1, Bush 2, Clinton, Biden. It's almost like there's this club that they all belong to, which appears to be the case. Between the Obama, Biden years and then recently the Trump years, do you think there's been a political realignment within the Democratic Party and Republican Party? Because there used to be a time where it seemed like the Democrats were the anti-war ones, and now it's almost in a time where, at least under Trump, the Trump Republican Party, there's not been a new war started, and rhetorically, Trump was trying to pull troops home and in these wars, and it appears that it could be the case he might do that before January. We shall see. But does it seem like we've entered a time where the Democratic Party is now more hawkish than the Republican Party?
Well, the party that's in power tends to be hawkish because America has consistently had a hawkish foreign policy since the end of World War II. Indeed, anybody who articulates for a reduction in American-led intervention is called an isolationist, and that harkens back to the term used for American politicians and American businessmen who articulated against getting involved in European wars in the 1930s against confronting Japan and the Pacific. The fact that Nazi Germany was a power worthy of confronting, that Imperial Japan likewise was a foe worthy of being confronted, put a taint on the notion of isolationism. And again, at the end of the war, we got this bipartisan support for this rules-based liberal world order. Basically the United States leading like-minded nations in creating a system designed to allegedly promote peace, but more importantly, promote their own interests. The Democrats, we can say, they're anti-war, but it was the Democrats under Kennedy and Johnson that got us involved in Vietnam. People will say, well, wait a minute, what about Eisenhower? It was Kennedy and Johnson that got us involved in the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon actually got us out of the Vietnam War, so the Republican Party was the anti-war party at that time. Ronald Reagan put forward a very aggressive policy towards the Soviet Union, calling them the evil empire. But it was Ronald Reagan who set forth the mechanisms of nuclear disarmament that led to the betterment of relations, so that by the time he left office, he was in the streets of Moscow telling the people of the Soviet Union that he no longer viewed them as enemies, that he said, we can be friends. That's not a party that's addicted to war. George H.W. Bush didn't necessarily want to go to war in the Middle East, but it was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait that led to Desert Storm and the decision to defeat Iraq and liberate Kuwait. But keep in mind that had George H.W. Bush truly been a president of war, we wouldn't have stopped with the liberation of Kuwait. We would have gone on and taken Baghdad. He didn't do that because he said that's not what we're there for. We're not there to invade nations, etc. And when Bill Clinton came into office in 1993, he was a Democrat with who didn't have any experience with foreign policy. He was a former governor of Arkansas. Didn't have any experience with the military. He famously dodged the draft, and yet he was now president. He was president in a changing world. The Cold War was over. The United Nations was looking to to have a global approach to solving the world's problems. But instead of sitting back and saying, okay, let's think of how the world can how we can move away from this post-world rules-based order that put the United States in the prime position. How can we now bring other nations into this? He said, no, America will retain this leadership position, And he had this policy of extreme interventionism. He intervened in Yugoslavia. He intervened in Iraq. Bill Clinton, is the man who put forward the policies that served as the foundation of George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq. For every decision that George W. Bush made, the predicate was Bill Clinton. When Barack Obama became president, he continued this policy of intervention, not a policy of peace, but a policy of peace through strength, meaning that we will continue to bomb, we will continue to occupy, we will double down on our previous commitments. Why is this the case? Because it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or if you're Republican. You are a prisoner to this notion that the United States is the head of this post-war rules-based liberal order. NATO our NATO alliance is a manifestation of that. Our other alliances around the world are a manifestation of that. That the United States must take the lead role in policing the world. And this is an establishment-based position. This is something that the Council for Foreign Relations supports. Whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, this is something that the Atlantic Council supports. Whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, this is something that the military-industrial complex supports. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. The United States elected Donald Trump, and I have to be honest, I was not a fan of Donald Trump. I still have a lot of problems with Donald Trump. But the one thing you can't say about Donald Trump is that he's a product of the Republican Party establishment. When he ran for office in 2015, 2016, he took on the entire Republican establishment, 17 candidates, former governors, former senators, current senators, and he beat them. He didn't beat them by appealing to the Republican Party to rally behind him. He beat them by defining his own political identity and getting the American people to rally behind that. He was going against the establishment, the embodiment of establishment politics, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who was nothing other than a person who had been, prepared by the establishment to be president. She was supposed to be anointed queen. He took her on, not because the Republican Party backed him. If we recall, a great segment of the Republican establishment took on a never Trump attitude. So when Donald Trump came in, he wasn't your normal president. He wasn't somebody who was beholden to the establishment. And yet, even then, he had trouble breaking free of establishment policies. Let's take the war in Iraq. When he came in, he was confronted by the generals and the politicians who said, we need to win this war, and we need you to help us win this war. And he said, well, wait a minute. Okay, what do you need? We need more troops. He gave them more troops. We need more money. He gave them more money. We need freer rules of engagement so we can bomb anything we want to bomb. He gave them freer rules of engagement. A year and a half later, he met with them. And, this is funny because Bob Woodward wrote a book, Raid. He interviewed Trump, and other people have talked about this, how Woodward says, Trump called our generals losers. He insulted our men in uniform. Oh, heck yeah, he did. Donald Trump called the generals in after he gave them everything they needed to win the war in Iraq or in Afghanistan. And he said, why are we still losing? Why aren't we winning this war? And he said, you guys are losers. You don't know how to win. You don't have the will to win. And we're not going to win under your leadership. So therefore, we're not going to be there. And he started the process of withdrawing our troops from Afghanistan, something that the Pentagon hates, that the military-industrial complex hates, that people like Joe Biden and the other politicians in Congress hate. Why? Because it goes against the grain. It goes against the model that we must intervene, that's the job of the United States. Donald Trump said it's bad. We're not winning the war. It's bad for business. We're blowing money. We're killing Americans. We're killing innocents, and we're making our job in the world of coexisting with other people more difficult. Trump is breaking the mold. Again, I have a lot of problems with Donald Trump, but his position on Afghanistan is not one of the areas I have a problem on. We lost that war. We can't win that war. There's no reason for us to continue to be in that war. And Donald Trump is the only American politician who's had the courage to say, I'm bringing the boys home. That's pretty good in my book.
Do you think the whole Russiagate mess attack on Donald Trump had anything to do with exactly what you're speaking on now and his foreign policy stance and his kind of outside of the club mentality?
Well, it's related. You're talking about Russiagate, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. The other thing that I appreciate from Donald, because remember, I'm an old, people need to understand when I talk about Russia where I'm coming from. I spent the years from 1984 to 1987, training to kill Russians. I joined the military to kill Russians. My dad was a career Air Force officer. I was raised around the world, including Turkey and Germany, where I graduated from high school during the Cold War, at a time when Germany was split into West and East, where we had the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 20th Combined Arms Army 5 hours march from my home. If the balloon went up, my dad would go into a bunker and we would be left in a house in a German village with a Soviet army coming down on us. I lived with the threat of nuclear war every day. We practiced drills. We saw the nuclear missiles go out into the field when there was emergency deployments. We saw the airplanes on strip alert with nuclear bombs attached to them. I viewed the Soviets, the Russians, as a threat worthy of putting my life on the line. I joined the military for the sole purpose of confronting the Soviet threat. I spent time in the Soviet Union, 2 years. I was at a Soviet city that no American had ever been to. I got to know the Russian people. I got to know their history. I got to appreciate their culture. And I realized that maybe the world's a better place if we learn to be friends, not surrender to them, but to be friends with them, to peacefully coexist with them. And that's something that Ronald Reagan came to a realization too. And I worked with the Russians when I was an inspector in Iraq. I had Russian missile experts on my team. The Russian government opened up their books about weapons they sold to Iraq. They didn't do that to anybody else, but they did it for me at the United Nations. So I know that we can cooperate with the Russians in a constructive manner because I've done it. So when I hear Donald Trump say, man, we don't have to be their enemy. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just get along with them? That resonated with me. He didn't say we're going to surrender to the Russians. He didn't say we're going to roll over and play dead and let the Russians do anything they want. He said, why don't we learn how to get along with these people, as opposed to the Obama administration policy of confrontation. I mean, a lot of Americans don't understand that what happened in Ukraine wasn't, so much a popular uprising against a pro-Russian president, but a CIA-backed color revolution, a coup, to remove a legally appointed, elected government and replace it with people that were handpicked by the United States for the sole purpose of destabilizing the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, whom Michael McFaul, Barack Obama's Russia advisor, hated. That's what was going on. So when Trump said, we can be friends with the Russians, this went against the grain of everything the establishment had geared itself up to. They were gearing up for recreating the Cold War, recasting Russia as the modern manifestation of the Soviet Union. I lived during that time, the first Cold War. It wasn't a fun time. Those weren't good times. Those were scary times, and we damn sure don't want to repeat them, excuse my language. But that's what Obama was doing. So when Trump said, hey, maybe we can figure out how to get along with these guys, I said, that's an objective that's worthy. That's worthy. And I love the fact that he's doing that. But when he got elected, the people who were so enraged at his election, the people who wanted to anoint Queen Hillary, who would have continued the policies of a confrontation with Russia, used Trump's willingness to reach out to Russia as a tool against him to fabricate an absolute false case of collusion, that somehow his campaign colluded with the Russians to steal an election from Hillary. And for 4 years, they attacked this man. They went after this man. They tried to tear down his presidency. They tried to remove him from office based upon this stuff. So yes, it played a heavy role in preventing a Trump administration, the 4 years that he's had so far, from achieving what it could have achieved. Imagine if Donald Trump had had the cooperation of Congress instead of the absolute opposition of Congress, what could have been done, what could have been accomplished. He had to anything that was accomplished by Donald Trump was accomplished solely by his force of will. Again, I'm not going to sit here and blow smoke at you and pretend that Donald Trump was the perfect president. Far from it. He surrounded himself with people that he should never have surrounded himself with, John Bolton's of the world. Even Mad Dog Mattis was not necessarily his best pick for Secretary of Defense because Mattis was cut out of the interventionist cloth. But despite the fact that he had people who weren't up to the task advising him, Trump still managed to do the right thing in many cases. And getting out of Afghanistan is one of the most right things that Donald Trump has tried to do.
Well, if Biden does end up being the eventual winner of this election. And who knows, we might not see this for weeks and weeks. But what are we to expect from a Biden-Harris foreign policy over the next 4 years?
Well, understand that Kamala Harris doesn't have a foreign policy. She has zero foreign policy experience. She has, some time as a senator where she could sit there and listen to other people talk about foreign policy, but she doesn't know it. So this is a Biden foreign policy. Now, at some point in time, Biden, may step aside, or after 4 years, may decide not to run if he becomes president, and Kamala Harris, could win her own term. And then there will be then we have to assess what kind of foreign policy she would put in. But she's not president; she's vice president. So it's Biden we have to worry about, and we can tell by the people that Biden is leaning towards in regards to the position of his cabinet, what kind of foreign policy he has. Michelle Flonery is somebody he's looking to make his Secretary of Defense. She's a longtime, Democrat with experience in the Defense Department. Look, first thing I'll say is she's got one heck of a resume. She is not unqualified for the job. If she went in as Secretary of Defense, she would know how to manage the Defense Department. There would not be incompetence. I'm not trying to cast her in that way, but she is an interventionist. She is somebody who pressured the Obama administration to get involved in Libya, to get involved in Syria. And in short, she is somebody who believes that the United States has a duty and obligation to intervene in areas of the world because it threatens to deviate away from, I'll use it again, the rules-based liberal world order. So that's the Secretary of Defense. Susan Rice, a name that should be known to many people, has been bandied about as being the Secretary of State. Again, she is articulated in favor of intervention in Syria, intervention in Libya, staying the course in Afghanistan, and being extremely aggressive towards Russia. And even China. So rather than trying to work with these nations and come up with compromise solutions to difficult problems, she seeks to impose America's will on two of the most powerful nations in the world, Russia and China. That's what our diplomacy would look like. Tony Blinken, was again a man who was the Deputy National Security Advisor under Obama. People are talking about him being National Security Advisor to a Biden administration. An interventionist, and again, a man who has never found an intervention where he wasn't willing to put American troops in harm's way to prosecute. Mike Morrell, former acting director of the Central Intelligence Agency. This is a man who famously or infamously wrote op-eds in the lead up to the 2016 election, where he basically called Donald Trump an agent of the Russian government. So this is a man who has basically built his career on the notion of aggressively confronting Russia, and was willing to manufacture lies about collusion between Trump and Russia for political purposes. He could be the director of the CIA. So those four alone should send shockwaves through the American public, because we're not going to get Mr. Stability under Joe Biden. When they say the adults are taking over our foreign and national security policy, they don't mean that we're going to get the kind of peace and harmony that normally comes with adult leadership. The warmongers are coming in. The interventionists are coming in. That's what we can look forward to with the Joe Biden foreign policy.
What do you think we would be with North Korea? Because I've heard this narrative when Trump at least attempted to have peace talks that, look at Donald Trump is cozying up to ruthless dictators. And it was such a strange narrative because I thought, obviously that's who you would like to at least try to make peace with. You can call it cozying up, I suppose. But where will we be with North Korea over the next 4 years in your mind?
Well, the one thing that the Biden administration is going to have to learn to deal with is the reality of 4 years of Trump foreign policy. And while you can criticize Trump foreign policy, understand that he has put things in motion that cannot be readily reversed. And one of the things he's done is broken when it comes to interacting with North Korea. He has sat down and met with the North Korean leader 3 times, doing 2 formal summits and then 1 informal gathering at the demilitarized zone. So it will be very difficult for Joe Biden to say, I will not meet with Kim Jong-un. In fact, Joe Biden has said, I will probably continue to meet with Kim Jong-un, but we will have a more structured framework of commitments going forward. Now, it'll be interesting to see him try and meet with Kim Jong-un while trying to dictate Kim Jong-un, because that's the one way to guarantee that you will never meet with Kim Jong-un. And that's why the summit's failed. Not because Trump was inclined to reach a compromise, but he was surrounded by advisors, John Bolton in particular, who, apparently the word compromise does not enter into their vocabulary. And on both occasions at Singapore and Hanoi, he had to walk away from what could have been game-changing agreements, where North Korea's nuclear weapons production capability would have been destroyed. They would still have had nuclear weapons that we would have to negotiate their eventual disposition, but the facilities that make the weapons would have been destroyed. That's a big deal, but we didn't get that because we still labor under the illusion that sanctions can somehow bend the will of nations, to what we want. Sanctions have never worked. They didn't work with Saddam. They aren't working with Iran. They aren't working with Russia. They didn't work with North Korea. But a Biden administration would continue to promote sanctions as the best policy means of achieving these objectives. So while Joe Biden won't be able to return to the day where we just refuse to meet with the North Korean leader, he will continue to push a policy that's sanction-based and trying to dictate an outcome as opposed to negotiate an outcome.
All right, Scott. Well, I think this is a good spot to wrap, but I know after hearing this, my listeners will want to find your work online. I'll let you plug anything you'd like right now, where you write, any podcast you do, your social media presence, any of that.
Well, I'm all new at this. I am on Twitter. I think the handle is the real Scott Ritter. I was sort of doing a tongue in cheek. My daughter asked me to get involved in Twitter, and she'd been following Donald Trump, so I mimicked his handle. And I publish a lot of my writings. I put them out on Twitter. So if you just follow me on Twitter, you should be able to read most of the things that I publish in a variety of outlets.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here, Scott. It's been very enjoyable. Appreciate this.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. What a great chat with Scott Ritter. This is one that should be shared because probably some of your lefty friends were out celebrating the election of Joe Biden. And do they know they just elected a warmonger? Maybe they do. Maybe they're not interested in pulling troops home. But anyway, I would suggest sharing this one and see what people think. As for this show, you know where to find everything, death2tyrantspodcast.com. And you guys that have been leaving these nice reviews and ratings on iTunes, thank you very much. Those of you that haven't, well, there's been a high bar set because some of you, these people listening, are saying some truly wonderful things, and I genuinely thank you from the bottom of my heart. So until next week, you guys have a good one.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.